Hi folks, it's Jim Martin. Today I want to talk about inflation. Quite clearly, all of us are suffering from the effects of inflation these days, and it's quite obvious when you go to the grocery store and buy a gallon of milk that cost $2.95 a couple years back and now it's $4.95. We know what it is. What is it that causes inflation? Let's talk a little history first. So after the fall of the Soviet Union, you had a tremendous amount of globalization driven by investors and governments in industrialized democracies around the world. So multinational companies based in Germany and France and England and the United States and other places, Japan, became very interested in creating these multi-layered supply chains that reached into a lot of the developing world in places like China and Vietnam and Eastern European countries and Russia itself, as well as to some degree in some of the African countries. What that meant was, here's some workers that get hired to produce fundamental pieces of some kind of device, let's say, and they produce it in a country that has very low labor rates, probably next to a raw material or energy resource that can be used. That is then shipped to a second country where those pieces are added to some other larger component piece, and then it's shipped to a third country where more assembly is done, and finally to the market in which it's going to be sold for final assembly. What that did was make things a lot cheaper. It was also secured by the fact that the United States Navy was the most powerful and pretty much dominant Navy in the world at that time. Any potential conflict that might arise, those shipping lanes would have been protected by the United States. Globalization in that form had a lot of negative externalities, a lot of positive externalities. We don't need to talk about those all now, but that was the system that was in place. The secondary motive for doing that, the first being profit, was to stabilize these things and sort of, in a strange sort of way, have a sort of an income transfer to a lot of these developing countries to avoid the potential for damaging economic collapses, civil wars, these kinds of things. When economies are doing better, then the likelihood of armed conflicts and all sorts of things is less. Also, we know that when countries do a lot of trade with each other, they tend to fight wars less often. This is the thinking behind this. Largely, globalization proceeded apace up until kind of the beginning of the Obama administration. And at that point, there began to be a retrenchment away from it. And this is in the form of multinational corporations are asking for, but it's also in the form of government policies that began this kind of withdrawal from that in some sense. In the United States, first took the form of quite a bit more energy infrastructure and exploitation being done within the territories of the United States. So for instance, you start to see a lot more oil, natural gas drilling, these kinds of things, buying things from Canada right next door. And you also see a lot more wind farms, right? And solar starting to pop up around those times. That was followed by the return of many sorts of manufacturing, from small and light to large, heavy kinds of manufacturing efforts. And this continued through the Obama administration, into the Trump administration, and through into the Biden administration. And it's certainly not done yet. What happens when you want to rebuild an industrial capacity? How do you do that? Well, you don't have a lot of workers who know how to do those kinds of things. And this is anything from simple, kind of coarse manufacturing up to, highly technical types of manufacturing work. You need to train workers to do that. That takes money. The government invested in that, as did private corporations and business. So you see this investment happening in that, which pumps money into the economy. Now, once you've trained those workers, you have to pay them more because this is an advanced industrialized democracy. And this counts for whether you're in France or Germany or the United States. You got to pay people more than you would have to pay an authoritarian regime like China or in Russia. So you're paying people more. They have more money. They want to spend that money, right? They want to buy some things with their money that they just got. This is great. It's the American way, right? So at the same time, After the financial crisis in 2007, the government in this country had set interest rates very low. The incentive was not to save your money. The incentive was to spend it. So for instance, if I'm going to buy a house, I'm not going to buy one when the interest rate's high. I'm going to buy it when it's low. Those kinds of factors already kind of produce this potential for inflation to occur. You've got a lot of people who have some more money. There's not really a lot of incentives for them not to spend it. And so they start spending it, right? Then as we move into more current times, we see the pandemic. And you see a lot of wealth transfer in that time from government to the people. And this happened all over the world because economists, policy experts, all those folks were like, hey man, this could end up in a global depression or at worst a severe recession that affects a lot of people. So we need to pump money in to keep people buying things and sustain the economy and everything else. And it did have its intended effect, which allowed people who were initially unemployed as a result of the pandemic to put food on the table and continue to live their lives, and it allowed some businesses to survive. As with any government program, there's waste involved and all those things. We all know that. That's not what we're here to talk about. But fundamental thing to take away is big dump of money into the economy. Meanwhile, they're still keeping those interest rates low all throughout the Trump administration, right? Then we have to talk about tariffs. This is another part of that retrenchment process. For decades and decades, countries did not use tariffs. They were kind of the economic equivalent of parking an aircraft carrier off your coast. You just didn't do it because you wanted to encourage this sort of interdependence and interconnectedness of the global economy. And so nobody put tariffs on much of anything. The number of tariffs the United States used over the last 50 years up until the Trump administration was almost none. Trump loved tariffs and he dumped them on everybody that he possibly could, pretty much. China, for sure, but also many of our European allies and trading partners of other sorts. What that does is when you could have bought something cheaper here and brought it over here and incorporated it into some sort of manufacturing, now you can't. You got to buy it domestically or at least perhaps in the NAFTA region. Prices go up again. The company passes that expense on to consumers who are willing to buy it and continue to be willing to spend the money on that. All of these things have conspired in a way to produce the situation where we see inflation. What are the tools that the government has to control that? Well, as we've seen, the Federal Reserve has raised interest rates during the Biden administration to encourage people to save money, invest money, as opposed to spending it right away. That has had some effect. That said, in this retrenchment process that is still ongoing and will continue to happen over the next decade or so, in all likelihood, you're not going to get rid of inflation anytime soon unless you take draconian measures like imposing price limits, which runs against any kind of principle of capitalism that there has been within any democratic state since the dawn of time. So, unfortunately, we can expect to have some level of inflation for the foreseeable future. I hope this has been helpful and interesting to you. If so, hit the like button and leave me a comment if you want. Keep them clean. I'll look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thanks a lot for stopping by today. Have a great day. Thanks.